You mentioned before when we were talking about why this was a subject of interest to economics that there's a tradition in economics of looking at externalities. And my recollection of undergraduate teaching was this goes back to Ronald Coates and trains going past wheat fields and scattering ash in them. And the solutions offered by economists have normally been to try and put a price on those externalities so that people who cause pollution, for example, will take that into account in the decisions they make. And there's a mechanism for the winners to compensate the losers, has always been part of the way economists think about these sorts of things. I guess it's interesting to reflect that at the 2007 election, the only difference between the coalition under John Howard and Labor under Kevin Rudd was when an emissions trading scheme should start. As a matter of 6 months or so, I think. And yet, ever since then, climate policy, energy policy has been one of the most divisive aspects of Australian politics. Most economists, I think, would still, take Ross Garnaut's cue that putting a price on carbon is the most efficient and equitable way of bringing the discipline of economics to bear on the problem of climate change and finding the most efficient solutions. But have we now moved past that point where putting a price on carbon is an acceptable or feasible way of dealing with climate change? And we just have to look at all these other more complex measures to achieve the goals that we've committed ourselves to?
So the answer is yes and no. I mean, never say never, but certainly at the moment it seems difficult. That said, there is a growing movement in the global community to have a floor price of carbon, and there are more and more countries signing up to that each year. Obviously, taking on a carbon price, you've then got to say, well, what's the rest of the world going to do? Is there carbon leakage? And of course, carbon border adjustment mechanisms are now becoming more common. And that's something that even Australia is considering. And you might say, well, why is that if we don't have a carbon price? But in fact, we do have a de facto carbon pricing mechanism, and that is the safeguard mechanism now. Yep. Because we have said that of worst polluters in this country, that they have to now be on a pathway to reduce their emissions. And over time, of course, it's only just started and we'll have to see how it plays out. But over time, if they're not able to do that, they will have to pay for those emissions. So we have a kind of mini carbon trading scheme, if you like.
With a high threshold or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, it's by stealth and it's not perfect, but it's there. And that there is the potential for that to be broadened over time as people realise, as I think many of us did when we did in fact have a carbon emissions trading scheme for 3 years, that the economy wasn't wrecked by it. Prices didn't go through the roof for everyone else. And there are mechanisms, of course, where you can adjust to help those that are low income households, for example. There are other countries around the world, and Europe is the obvious example where they've had one in operation for a long time. Obviously not a well-designed scheme to start off with, but now starting to really have an impact over there. So, I can't see us having an emissions trading scheme economy-wide in the short term. But so we're going to end up having these bits and pieces along the way until we get there. But I live in hope that the world will get some sense, because obviously that is the most economically efficient way. I lament to think, what we could have been doing now if only we'd kept the ETS in place.
Yes, it's funny how politics can get in the way of sensible economics under a variety of situations. But one of the other insights that economics can bring to this debate is reconciling the long-term distant future with the present. Could you talk to us a bit about the insights that economics offers to reconciling the potentially conflicting or apparently diverging interests between the distant future and the immediate present?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conundrum for economists when looking at climate impacts, that often what we're talking about is what's happening in 2050 or 2070 or even 2100. And of course, as you know, the standard rule is to take a discount rate. Yep. And say, well, whatever costs or benefits that you get down the track, that's not worth as much today as it is in the future. And we don't argue about that. We might argue about the rate that governments use, and it's good to see New South Wales has finally come down from to the 5% as their central discount rate case. But even that, when you're talking about the impact of life itself on future generations, you have to take a slightly different view. And in fact, a survey that was done a few years ago of leading climate economists right around the world, the average was that we should set the discount rate at around 2%, 2.25%, to reflect the fact that we shouldn't be discounting, if having a much higher discount rate is essentially saying, well, the world will be more wealthy and you people down the track, you'll work it all out for yourself. Don't worry about it. It's not actually taking into account what those impacts are. It's valuing our life today more than those future generations. And it's possibly unique to the climate issue in terms of the longevity of the policies. And of course, when you have political cycles that go 3 or maximum 4 years, it becomes very, very difficult for politicians with those sorts of rates. If you look at countries like Canada or the European Union, you see that they do use much lower discount rates when determining the way they use, using a carbon price, the social cost of carbon in their cost benefit analysis to reflect the fact that future generations have as much right to have us solve this problem today as we do. It's kind of counter to a lot of what we do in our standard economic practice.
Yeah, but I suppose in a sense the choice of discount rate is, as I think you were saying, I'm just putting it in a different way, is an expression of the weight we put on our grandchildren's and their successive generations' interests versus our own.
Yeah, 100%. The Iroquois in America have a saying about this, the 7 generation idea, and that is that any decision you make has to be beneficial for at least 7 generations. And I think if only we thought that way, but obviously the realities of politics and budget deficits tends to get in the way a little bit.
Yeah, and when you have a 3-year election cycle, I guess that just reinforces that.